said tango was like sex standing up. And then she was like, well, not always. Okay. I'm going to read two things, and I hope this is coherent. I wanted to start with just the first three paragraphs here, because it sort of sets up my mood for the whole book. And then I'm going to skip to a scene. Katie said that this book is very meta. So for all of those literary people out there, that sort of means that I'm playing God a little bit. I'm sort of reminding you that you're the reader and I'm the writer. And this is what I'm doing. And at this beginning part, I'm setting that up. Still feels weird to me.
You sound fine.
Do I? Look like an ass. Okay. Okay. We all know the first line is the most important. It sets the tone, tells you what the story will be about. Call me Viviana. Would Melville approve? How about copying straight from Heller? It was love at first sight. We all remember Lolita. How would Nabokov do it? What if I just come out and say it? This book is the answer to the notion that women ought to fear asking for what they want the most, whether it's time alone to write, demanding for and getting respect, or a patient hand under which to soften up and eventually get off. You know what's worse? We know we won't get it anyway. Fuck virtue. This document serves as my recognition of the notion that I am doomed, by virtue of my gender, to a life of boredom, inanity, and servitude. An old man in Arizona has over 70 wives. If a woman ever said one man wasn't enough for her, you know what they would say about her? I could spend at least 10 minutes on the list. Making up lists is a great writing exercise, by the way. I learned that from my father. He won a Pulitzer Prize in 1989 for his novel, Taking Ivy Down. Dear old dad. Okay, so here I'm going to switch to the piece that's relevant to Benaroya Hall. Before I could answer my mother, the lights went down, and a white-haired woman walked up to the podium and spoke for several long minutes about the importance of Jasper's work and listed his credentials. It was college all over again, like we couldn't read the program. Most of the people here were probably as in love with him as my mother was, and already knew this stuff anyway. A New Yorker article at 19, an O. Henry Award at 23, finalist for the National Book Award for his second novel at 27. Now this current one was getting the right reviews in the right publications. After several long minutes of introduction, the woman stretched an arm toward the side of the stage and Jasper emerged, tipping his head back to look up into the rafters, shielding his eyes from the stage lights. Since I'd seen him, he'd cut his hair, and it seemed to have darkened. Gone was the puffy geek look. Here he stood, tall, slender, dark-haired guy with compact black spectacles and a deep gray button-down shirt. He took a full minute to remove his jacket, folding it over once. He bent to his bag, dug through it, removing several scattered pages and placing the jacket on top of the bag, and he stood. He looked around, adjusted the microphone, ran his hand through his lightly feathered hair. He took the glass of water that sat on the podium that I forgot to bring up here for a prop, brought it to his lips, took a sip, placed the glass black down, and slid it to the side of the podium with the backs of his fingers. His fingers wrapped around the sheets of paper in front of him, tapped them in a neat, orderly pile, the sound echoing crisp in the silent anticipation of the audience. Finally, he placed his feet apart and looked out on the crowd. Geez, he knocked 5 minutes off his talk time right there, I said. Mother shot me a look with narrow eyes and placed her finger to her lips. She leaned toward me and said, I want to see this. Your brother thought so highly of him. I want to listen more clearly this time. She still thought he was some kind of hero. I couldn't wreck her feeling that she was in the presence of some positive way to remember my brother. Her face was like that of someone in church, turned up, rapt, worshipful. Jasper rolled up his sleeves on his crisp button-down shirt and leaned forward, wrapping both hands around each side of the podium. He looked down at the pages in front of him, cleared his throat, and said, It's an honor to be asked to appear here. I will be reading from a speech I gave last year in the UK. He arched his back and put his hand down the back of his pants, pushing his shirt down. I don't get out much, and it is great to see so many people willing to come out for the sake of literature. Oh, brother, like no one else knows how to read. He's surprised that anyone else reads literature. I said under my breath. An older woman down below turned and looked into the balcony, unable to figure out exactly where the voice had come from. Mother shifted in her seat, looked around and faced forward and pretended she hadn't heard me. I decided to behave myself and pulled the fabric of my jacket over my lap and began to examine it. I did listen, though most of what I heard sat with me and lodged itself in the place where my worries went to harden into full-blown anxieties. The main thrust of what he spoke about was getting to the place where he, as a writer, was afraid, and working with that material, often for years, before knowing if he had anything worthwhile. No wonder my brother had to end his life if this is what he had to look forward to. The performance was truly comic. How many times he had to stop to correct some reference that wasn't applicable anymore. He lifted his head at one point and said, "I promise I'm going to go home and update this speech." He got a soft, patient laugh from the audience. I shook my head and made a big show of putting my head in my hands. After a few moments, the only thing I could do was sit still, lest I slip out an insult or worse. Images of my brother hunched over his laptop, printing that stupid letter, scribbling on it, tossing it aside, starting over. Nausea rose in my throat, imagining the reverent tone he was searching for hours and possibly days. Then my throat tightened again, almost a daily occurrence until a few months ago. Apparently the feelings were back. Lovely. What had Tristan finally told this fair author? You inspire me, or more awful, how can I be like you? God, I hoped my brother hadn't sunk as low as soliciting advice. I imagined Jasper skimming the letter and tossing it aside, scurrying back to his work hole, blocking out the rest of the world. Jasper went on for another 20 minutes, then took questions from the audience. When the applause finally died down and the lights came back up, I was the first to stand. So, I asked my mother as we filed toward the reception area, could he have delivered that any worse? I think he's just a tortured soul, working so hard in seclusion. And he hardly ever gets out, Eric offered my mother, then gave me a pointed look before leading her ahead. It shows, I said. Servers in black and white were setting out assorted cheeses and bread. A stiff young man stood next to a round table topped with assorted glasses of wine and big round water glasses. When we got to the area and could go no further, my mother turned to me. Honestly, Viviana, I don't know what has gotten into you. I did not raise you to behave this way. She looked to Eric, then to me, and stalked off to stand in line. I hung back. What's the deal? He said, squeezing my arm. When he did this, the facade I'd built began to crack. I wouldn't tell my mother this, I said, hearing my voice waver. I took a breath and let it out my nose. The air was cool and I closed my eyes. My brother loved this guy, wrote him letters, read every stupid long-winded book he ever said was an influence. He worshipped him. That's why your mother wanted you to come to this with her, Eric said. Yeah. So we go to this conference in Montana. He spoke there, and Tristan waited a half hour to be able to talk to him. And then when he finally got there, Jasper just waved at him and ran off with his fucking bimbo. What did Tristan do? Nothing. Made excuses for him. Typical Tristan. Eric crossed his arms. So what do you want to do? I bit my lip. My stomach churned. I didn't want to make a scene. That was the last thing I wanted. I leaned over on tiptoes and saw that my mother was in line 2 people back and would soon be able to talk to Jasper. I paced while Eric watched me. On one hand, it would give him immeasurable satisfaction to tell Jasper what I thought of him, to tell him just what his lack of courtesy had cost my brother, had cost me. What would Tristan think? Silly. But I looked around the room, hoping to get a glance of him or someone who looked like him. Something that happened every so often, just enough to give me comfort. There was just Eric, and then my mother was stalking over. Well, I did it. I told him he was a wonderful writer and that my son loved his work. He was very gracious. We can go now. With a glance at Jasper, I said, I'm going to catch a cab home. My mother put her hands up and let them fall. You? She looked at Eric. He gripped her elbow and said, I'll walk you to your car. As I waited my turn in line, Barbara passed me. She took a look at me and stopped. Everything okay? I nodded and gave her my biggest smile until she stopped searching my eyes and whisked back toward the exit in a cloud of jingling bracelets and sandalwood perfume. I felt Jasper's eyes on me while there were still a few people ahead. I stared back hard, then dropped my eyes. There were now only 3 people left in line. Eric stood back against the far wall, arms crossed, and tipped his head lightly to me, urging me on. My stomach dropped, and I stepped back to allow the people behind me to go ahead, buying time, and I watched him again. Every time I made contact with his deep green and gold eyes, I reminded myself that I had a purpose. When the guy in front of me with the gray ponytail moved off, Jasper Caldwell stood before me, and I paused to let the moment sink in. Every fiber of me shot through with nervous tension, tingling at the back of my neck. I put up my hand, and he took it. Already, I was farther than Tristan ever got. That's it. Thank you, guys. I was going to do a 5-minute, really quick thing to save y'all's feet, but I had to use this place because this is where everyone comes that I worship anyway. And Maureen's going to go on, and then we are going to dance and have tons of fun. Thank you guys for coming.